Hello, everyone. This is Oran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin. Today, we will continue our discussion on Gillian Rose's book, Hegel Contra Sociology, with my friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi, everybody. This is Shen. I'm a comparative culture historian working on the global Middle Ages. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you around today to continue our conversation on Rose, of course.
Yeah. So this is our third and final episode on Rose's book, Hegel Contra Sociology. So far, we have talked about the general purpose and bold aim of the book as putting Hegel and Hegelian philosophy in opposition and in contrast, not only to Kant, which has been done a lot in the Hegel scholarship, but also against the Kantian and neo-Kantian roots of modern sociology, 19th century and 20th century, and probably 21st century sociology. And what Rose does, as we have discussed in the past two episodes, is to go over different texts from Hegel, show what are the problems that Hegel sees with Kant, and at the same time, especially in the beginning and the end of the book, show us why those problems exist in sociological thought, post-Kantian sociological thought as well. One of the issues that we discussed was the problem of method, that Hegel thinks that problem of method that exists in Kant, the self-buffering of reason, self-buffering of certain concepts, exists not only in Kant, but also in the so-called critiques of Kant in post-Kantian philosophy and sociology. And the last time we talked about the problem of dichotomic thinking, the problem of presupposing or positing pairs of concepts as fixed in their distinctness. In other words, presupposing their distinctness, and the project of trying to find a way to bridge them. The system, the Kantian system and the post-Kantian thinking in humanities and social sciences, according to Rose, not only posits these types of concepts, but realizes that there must be a bridge between them. Otherwise, the system will be incoherent for all sorts of reasons. But in the process of bridging the two, it again buffers that original presupposition that there is a distinction, there is an absolute opposition between these concepts. So the bridging ends up taking a specific shape, and that specific shape is a dominance relationship, a subsumption relationship. One concept is relativized to the other. The resolution does not really solve the problem of the original distinction, but forces the concepts to come together in one way or another. And this dichotomy thinking showed itself in all sorts of contexts, and we gave the general term to all of those expressions that Rose discusses in the book. And that general term is the tyranny of the Sollen. Sollen is the German for odd. And we use that term because the emphasis, the main emphasis of Rose is on Kant's morality and how the art of the morality dominates the Sitte, the ethical life, the actual social relations in Kant's philosophy. But we also talked about other ways that this tyranny reveals itself. And Tren, do you want to tell us a little bit more about those shapes?
Yes. We examined three examples provided in Rose's book. Last episode, the first is the French Revolution, second is the Christianity, specific the Western Christianity as it is in the history of Western civilization. And finally, is the Kantian morality. And personally, I think a great way to see the parallels across these three examples are to see what's the unit that takes up the burden or task to materialize or to implement that Sollen, that should, at a social scale. So if you think about the French Revolution, the unit is the state, which through its claim of sovereignty and law, and used above everything violence to implement an ideal social blueprint. If you disagree with the way that the society or the needs or ought you to be in a specific position, then you must be forced into that position. And Christianity, we can say that, for the sake of fun, call that unit for the moment the religion, which is definitely not the state, because especially in the early period, it was quite separated from state power. It was, in fact, under some form of persecution. Yet, it also claimed its historical as well as eschatological, related to salvation, role to implement an ideal social relationship on our world, like kingdom for God. But here, the proposed method is no longer violence, but rather through the concept of love. It was separation was not between society and state, as it was the case in French Revolution, but rather between a transcendent, divine organization of a human relationship, the city of God, which would, through God's incarnation, through Christ's love, self-sacrificing love, that eventually bridges the gap introduced in the separation, absolute separation. Finally, Kantian morality here is very interesting. The unit is no longer collective by nature, but rather individualized. So individual is now taking up the responsibility to enforce that so-called rational or rationalized moral understanding onto all kinds of social obligation. So the recipient here could be, I don't know, could be the individual him or herself, but also society as a collection of multiple individuals. And the means here, perhaps, my understanding, don't see that in the book, is perhaps best described as education or self-cultivation. Right now, it's very enlightenment spirit, self-making, basically, through internalizing certain ideals. Individuals basically monitor, supervise their behavior to conform to ideal individuality that is predetermined and prejudged. And that is the way to bridge the gap between Zolan and Zeta. That's my understanding. Of course, here we see the three means to achieve this ends are seemingly very different, but they are like the Christian Trinity. They are interdependent. Violence, love, and, say, educational persuasion, they are very much interconnected. When Christianity merged with state power, it had absolutely no problem using violence to enforce its a social policy in name of love. And education, similar. It goes in our society hand in hand with punishment, with legal discipline. So yes, I think these three examples really encapsulate how this dichotomy thinking would not just remain in, say, intellectual circle, but also manifested in social relationship, social movement. Conceptual tension, I think, in the Hegel system never just stopped there, because there's no absolute boundary, as we imagine, between, say, the intellectual realm and the realm of the social ethical relationship. And one more thing I want to comment on is to connect these three examples, and of course the dichotomy thinking embodied within with the existing debate on between the Enlightenment and the Kantian Enlightenment thinking. We mentioned there's in Kantian Enlightenment debate, there's a problem between nihilism on one hand and the rationalism on the other in terms of knowledge, epistemology. And here we can see, very interestingly, in our contemporary discourse, that our concept of state, religion, and selfhood or individuality are to a large extent informed by these three, to a certain extent, outliers, so at least unstable moments in history. French Revolution, Christianity, and Kantian morality, but that imposes a very important limit on contemporary sociologists understanding what constitutes relevant data for the very category of state, religion, and self. So the dichotomy thinking implemented in the specific moment just did not just stop there. It also cast a long shadow on our contemporary revisit of this such categories. And in a way, our limited understanding makes the problematic legacy of such absolute dichotomy still very much alive with us. And I think that's how a Kantian project, even through its critique or revisit, could preserve its dichotomic thinking root in new Kantian projects and Rose's understanding. So now back to you. I think
This is perfect. This is perfect. I loved it. Yes, and it is interesting in the case of Kant, the tyranny becomes some sort of self-tyranny. And that is interesting, that the contrast with more like the French Revolution version of this, that is the tyranny has more external structure between the state and the society. But here in Kant, the fight is coming back inside. It's an internal structure, and how these cases, French Revolution, the state in the French Revolution, the religion in Christianity, and morality, agency in Kant, right, they become the paradigm cases, right, while they're not really paradigms in terms of their representative of the like history of humankind in right, terms of how we have understood ourselves. Now we could, there is a question of whether they have become paradigms because there is some truth about them that, right, makes them paradigms, but there is a need for a skeptical viewpoint of like thinking of this French Revolution as the birth of the ultimate model of statehood. Yeah. Seems a little bit too universalizing, even for the ears and mouths of people who are not necessarily counter Enlightenment. That seems to be too all-encompassing and too fast, or too like, it's French Revolution did not happen that long time ago, and human beings have been around. So that seems to be a very limited view on what the state is. So in all of these cases that we talked about in terms of absolute dichotomies, the absolute dichotomies, yes, in all of these cases, and also the problem of method. Now it's the time in this episode to see that where is Hegel in this story? Not Hegel as the contrarian or the critique, or someone who is not Kant or neo-Kantian, but what is Hegel's contribution here that Rose seems to assume or seems to try to argue for? And all of the roads lead to one concept in Hegelian philosophy as the solution. And that concept is the concept of the absolute. It seems from reading Rose that Rose takes this concept, comprehension of this concept, and we're going to have some discussions about what this even comprehension means. The comprehension of the concept of the absolute is the solution to the problem of dichotomic thinking, right? If we appreciate Hegel's conception of the absolute, we have found the problem to the problem, we have found the solution to the problem of dichotomic thinking. Now, there are three major questions in doing this. Which absolute, what kind of a solution, and to which dichotomy? And what we are going to do in this episode is to dig these questions, to try to see how we can move from this abstract general statement as Hegelian absolute is the solution to the problem of dichotomic thinking to a better set of questions. So me and Trent think about this conversation as more than explaining or explicating the answers to the question of how this is actually going to work out. Mm-hmm. More than that, we are trying to find really good questions here that Rose herself does not necessarily answer, but anyone who appreciates Rose's project or the concerns with the Kantian roots of post-Kantian philosophy and thinking in humanity and social sciences must ask themselves. And in the rest of these conversations that we're going to have on many different books, all of these questions are going to hopefully get more solid answers and more solid shapes.
Right.
So we will start with the dichotomy question.
Right.
Which dichotomy is it that we are dealing with? And when we look at the text itself, Rose's book on Hegel, Hegel Contra Sociology, what we see is that there are not just one, it's not just one dichotomy that she talks about. For instance, in 47, she talks about the dichotomy of morality and legality. And that dichotomy is something that is present in the book over and over again. And, you know, the relationship between Sittlichkeit and morality, and that's something that we discussed. Right. And how she thinks that, you know, the problem of morality is that it wants to separate itself from the Sittlichkeit, and in that separation, it both becomes meaningless and also tyrannical in terms of how it wants to kind of subsume the Sittlichkeit. So morality and Sittlichkeit, morality and legality, and the whole thing about legality is also going to be important in our further discussions with Tran. Like what is legality? What is this concept of legality? That's one of the dichotomies that is presented in the book. But when she talks about System der Sittlichkeit, one of the earlier works of Hegel, in 63, she mentions that the Hegel's basic dichotomy, his shorthand for critical philosophy, quoting directly, is a dichotomy between concept and intuition, instead of the dichotomies between reason and nature, infinite and finite, unity and multiplicity, without a bound in the essay on natural law. So two things that she's talking about. One is that in that text, the basic dichotomy is the dichotomy of concept and intuition, but there are also other dichotomies that Hegel is interested in other works, right? And there is another overarching theme in terms of the dichotomic thinking that Rose brings out repeatedly, and that is where she wants to talk about, you know, the distinction between Hegel and Kant and Fichte. When Kant and Fichte are put together, then there is another level of this dichotomy. And Rose writes in 219 that Hegel's thought was directed against the dichotomy of theory and practice, for it's precisely this distinction which prevents the realization of philosophy and condemns it to being the unrealizable concept of unity or freedom, which is imposed or which dominate. So now that we have the dichotomy of theory and practice, the theoretical and the practical. And she also mentions different dichotomies when it comes to the sociological. For instance, the distinction between structural sociology and action theory. And Trent, could you tell us about that?
Yes, I think here, if we want to orient our listeners to this dichotomy, we can probably think of a pair of uneasy relationship between two concepts. One is individual, the other is a society. And according to Rose, and I personally agree with Rose in her assessment of contemporary sociology, is there are two big camps. One is so-called structural sociology. The primacy is located firmly in the concept of society. The most representative thinkers, perhaps the Emile Kant, that individuals are born into social facts, which are, of course, postulated, but nonetheless powerful, because that structure human beings. And those in the Kantian analysis are grounded or endowed with identity, so to speak. For instance, language. Language never exists outside human communication, but turn language into a social fact. Individuals are born into a specific language. That language is beyond the specific instant of a speech act. It's something out there with long-lasting identity. It changes, of course, but it exists. And it's a fitting unit for sociological analysis, according to Kant. But on the other hand, you can dominate from the other end, that is the action theory, that is the premise is located in individuals instead of society, and we social scientists that interpret society basically by making sense of how individuals structure their social relationship. So we're trying to see how individuals concord, associate meanings with their action. So most typical example here is perhaps Max Weber, but I think Weber is more subtle, but still in this, and still succumb to this dichotomic thinking, as it comes up with a concept of rationalization, which individuals, to a certain extent, his or her life story is informed by a certain set of cultural assumptions, which are systematized into a structure that one conviction would support another. And the basic unit of analysis here is an individual, because those convictions are clearly manifested in individuals' aware or unaware conviction and their behavior accordingly. Yes. So that's the basic understanding of how this dichotomy thinking manifests also in sociology in our time. Yes. Back to your philosophy.
That's interesting, because you can see that if we add these elements that Trent just talked about, like the individual and society, that's another dichotomy. This activity and actuality, that's another dichotomy. It becomes kind of baffling, or it could become baffling, that if Hegel's absolute is the solution to the problem of dichotomy thinking, which of these dichotomies it wants to resolve? Now, there are a couple of ways that we could answer this question. And again, maybe we don't have the final answer here, but we can have better questions, and we can, take a guess of what is going on, a reasonable guess based on what is going on. One way to look at this is that these dichotomies have their own, each of them has its own structure. We need to talk about it kind of independently, and they don't really talk to one another. Like infinite and finite is not going to be the same as individuality and society. And I'm sure Hegel's attention in different texts would be on different types of dichotomies. So Rose is definitely correct in saying that, for instance, like System der Sittlichkeit is far more interested in the dichotomy between concept and intuition than unity and multiplicity. But I suspect that at the core of all of these dichotomies, there are two dichotomies that are two expressions of the same dichotomy, I think, that are the basic forms of the dichotomy. And in a very broad sense, I would call that subject-object dichotomy.
Right.
By object, it is also, I think, helpful to think about this subjectivity and objectivity. That might make it more clear what is going on here. If we want to give this enlightenment counter-enlightenment twist, I think the same dichotomy at the core dichotomy is a dichotomy between universal and particular. But by the way, in the Hegelian terminology, that is not per se a dichotomy in the sense that individuality is a concept there too, like universality, individuality, and particularity. But the structure, we can think about it in the dichotomy structure is the particular and the universal, right? So I think at that level, when we're thinking about like if the absolute is the solution to the problem of dichotomy thinking, which dichotomy? At the core of it, it's that dichotomy. In the very basic conceptual sense, the relation between universal and particular. In a more maybe practical sense, and we will say like why that would be problematic for Hegel, but subjectivity and objectivity might have a more flesh on its bones. So that's how I think this whole dichotomy works. All of these dichotomies will have that structural similarity, although maybe resolving each of them needs a variant of the absolute, or needs a more a specified way of approaching, but the basic dichotomy is going to be that dichotomy.
Yes, I very much love the way you use subjectivity versus objectivity, and the other is the particular versus the universal to summarize all this. We can just keep going on. This list can self-generate and percolate. I just want to say, for instance, still using sociological theories to fit your model, I think key difference between, say, Weber and Durkheim is to what extent social agent's personal understanding what he or she is doing matters. That's for Durkheim, that doesn't matter. We can measure stuff from without. We can use the statistics. We can check what's the percentage of people committed suicide in a certain society, regardless of why they think was the necessary case to bring them to that stage. And we can use this statistics, for instance, Northern European countries, economically better, but like a higher suicide rate means perhaps there's a psychological issue, whatever it was, the general well-being of the society comparing to some Mediterranean countries. So here, perhaps the objectivity is dominating, like subjectivity. But for Weber, it's the other way. You cannot. This kind of statistics is meaningless unless you really investigate how individual reach this very important decision in their life. And similar is, yes, you can also use universal and particular as a way to measure the two. For instance, Weber pays so much attention on the concept of value rationality or culture in our Papillon, basically following Herder's that trend of Kantian thinking that cultures are not easily translatable. They have their particularity. We should take this particularity very seriously. But in, say, Durkheim's sociological model method, the universal dimension of a society is much more highlighted. That we have certain criteria, we can use it to measure every human community as a unit or group of society. Every society has a language, every society has infant birth rate, that has a life expectancy at birth, that has, I don't know, like a gender ratio, all those things, regardless of how the culture provides symbol to account for, those things are universal. So just to kind of affirm, I think that the two major dichotomy you identified are absolutely the core of a sociological debates and thinking. So yes, we don't miss much.
Yeah,
to us.
Yeah, that's interesting that it seems like the same, like identifying universal, particular, and subjectivity and objectivity as the basic dichotomy seems to at least fit the basic dichotomic structure in sociology at the core, which is what Rose is also claiming. Yeah. So that is about the dichotomy part. Now, the second question that we are trying to answer or get better questions at, right, is the concept of the absolute itself. When we are talking about the absolute, what kind of a thing we're talking about? And we're going to return to this topic at the end of this episode too. But one basic question here is the two ways that Rose and, of course, Hegel use the term absolute. One is absolute knowledge, and the other is absolute ethical life.
Right.
And absolute knowledge, first of all, very much dominant in the phenomenology, right? That's the closure of the Hegel's phenomenology is an absolute knowledge. And from what I researched, not much use of the word absolute ethical life. Of course, absolute knowledge happens under like ethical life, right? Ethical life is there, but the term is not there. And very much absent in Rose. The only quote that exists on absolute knowledge in Rose's Hegel Contra Sociology is the way that she is describing the absolute knowledge in the phenomenology. So she says absolute knowledge is a path which must be continually traversed, recollecting the forms of consciousness and the forms of science. This idea of a whole which cannot be grasped in one moment or in one statement, for it must be experienced, is the idea of the system. So here she is, first of all, giving us some sort of a glimpse that what kind of a thing we were dealing with when we were talking about the absolute. But that's about absolute knowledge. Then we have absolute ethical life, which is very much present in Rose's book. Mm-hmm. For instance, just to have an idea of like in what kind of way she talks about absolute ethical life, take notice of this. I'm quoting directly. Absolute ethical life does not mean simply the sum of social relations. It means a unity which includes all the real property relations, all the lack of identities in social life. It is only by acknowledging the lack of identity as the historical fate, Bestimmung, of a different property structure that absolute ethical life can be conceived. Okay. Now, knowledge and ethical life. If you don't want to get too Hegelian here and like look at these two concepts, juxtapose them, knowledge seems to be an intellectual achievement. It could be thought as something that is socially achieved, maybe. It could be described as something that is dependent on social structure. It could be thought of as knowledge that a tribe acquires, right? But it is still, it has the feeling of an intellectual achievement. Mm-hmm. Ethical life, on the other hand, is a societal structure. Ethical life, forget about absolute ethical life for a second. Ethical life has that element of social relations. Mm-hmm. As Rose mentions, it's not just the sum of social relations, but about that unity of the lack of identities in the social life as well. It's not just piling up, it's not amalgamation of different social relations, but it has that kind of idea that all of these things together with all of the lack of unities that exist at the different stages. When I picture ethical life, I am not thinking about knowledge. I am thinking about something that is existing within a society. Now, there could be a knowledge of that ethical life, but that ethical life itself is not equal to knowledge, right, at least from the outset. Now, which absolute are we talking about? And what is the relationship between these two? And one of the ways that Rose addresses this, she doesn't address this question directly, but what she does, and I won't go through the whole quotation, which is on 45, but the idea is that we need, or we don't need, but it is helpful to map out different parts of Hegel's system to Kant's system, and then realize that that mapping itself is incomplete. So she thinks that there is this trinity, the idea of a phenomenology, the idea of absolute ethical life, and the idea of a logic. Phenomenology is equivalent, or could be thought as something parallel to the theoretical justification that Kant wants to give in the first critique. I take that to mean the theoretical problem of the relationship between the self and the world, right? And the idea of absolute ethical life is about Kant's justification of moral judgments, morality, and where Hegel shows that justification is incomplete unless the idea of ethical life is introduced. So it is more present in texts that Hegel, quote unquote, is focused on practical questions or practical dichotomies. But Rose tells us that if we accept that, phenomenology is answering a theoretical question, and, other texts the practical texts are answering the question of the practical issues of morality and ethical life, we have conceded the dichotomy between theoretical and practical reason, which is not something that Hegel wants to do. So the idea of logic in Hegel's logic, science of logic, is to show that these are just two sides of the same coin, that the phenomenology and the idea of absolute life, absolute ethical life coincide somehow. That doesn't necessarily solve anything for us, but brings out this idea that there is something to be answered about the presence and meaning of knowledge and its relationship to the ethical life in Hegel's conception of the absolute. And we are going to return to this problem in a more direct way very soon. But before we move on, Trent, do you want to add anything to what I just said?
I'm just to clarify that I'm not a student of Kant or Hegel, so I'm struggling here to understand the basic relationship between the two. But I want to ask, so if we take out absolute from both absolute knowledge and the ethical life, and we can, for the matter of argument, qualify knowledge as limited first as, I don't know, can we limit it to moral knowledge? In that sense, it's basically a conversation with Kant's dichotomy between theory and practice, that you have morality on one hand, you have a ethical life on the other hand, and they have certain like interrelation. But that's clearly not what Hegel has in mind, because that's why he introduced the third pillar here, namely the idea of logic, and also qualifies the two with first the concept of absolute, and phenomenology doesn't seem the same as, say, Kant's very much, how to say, mechanistic or rational, how to put it, I don't know, for lack of a better term, rational calculation to a certain extent. Phenomenology means that you must take into, my understanding, you must take into consideration the agent's self-consciousness. It's not just your observation, your, how to put it, making sense of what a person is doing. So how does Hegel perhaps envision, I think my question is, how does Hegel really envision these three pillars interact with each other? Does one need, Rose called it a trinity, and the Christian trinity means that one cannot be meaningful or defined or understood without a reference to the other two. So is it the case here, or is there a hierarchical relationship, perhaps logic as a kind of summation or bringing together the two? Or so what's your understanding of the relationship?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think this is a very contentious question in terms of how people understand Hegel. Like, there are people like Stephen Holgate, whom we're gonna discuss later in these conversations, that he thinks that there are different paths to get to Hegel's logic, and one is phenomenology, but the other is some radical skepticism that could come without the phenomenology, right? And there are other like presuppositions of getting into how we get into a logic in the science of logic, which means that there are some socio-historical necessities, according to Hegel, to be able to formulate the logic even. But my understanding is the more dominant viewpoint is that the education that the phenomenology provides, the education of consciousness, of basically knowing what it means to be it, what it means to be the consciousness of that story. The knowledge and self-knowledge in that story coincide. Self-locating oneself in the relationship with the world, self-locating of the subject in its relationship to the other, to the world, to the object. That is the standpoint of the absolute. That's the absolute knowledge. Knowing that relationship is the standpoint of the absolute. And then logic is something that happens because someone has reached that level. Only from that perspective, the project of logic makes sense. And I understand why that would be the case. Like if you are, for instance, thinking that, you know, the world is like, let's take the first chapter of phenomenology, right? Sense certainty. Thinking that the world is concepts distort reality, right? And the way to understand the world is to just passively receive whatever is given. Like just this passive reception of the given is knowledge. That's the absolute, right? That's how you find the unpolluted knowledge of yourself and the world, right? If you're taking that position, like I don't think the project of logic makes sense if you are there, right? If you are thinking of the world in that way or thinking about the self in that way, it does not seem to make much sense to look for anything more. I think the project of phenomenology in a way justifies the project of logic. Now, what are all these other texts like philosophy of right? Is it that just Hegel is emphasizing on, like, what is the relationship between phenomenology and philosophy of right? Is the phenomenology required to understand the philosophy of right? That might be a little bit trickier. But I think overall, there is that hierarchy. The phenomenology of the spirit is the beginning, is the first, that's the 101, you know, that's the education. Then you are at the end of the phenomenology, you reach the standpoint of philosophy. That's how Hegel puts it. And from there, you can do philosophy. So phenomenology itself is not philosophy proper.
Right.
Phenomenology is how you get to know what is even to do philosophy. Like a lot of the positions that exist in the phenomenology are not, you know, philosophical. They don't even take philosophy seriously in some cases. So in that sense, phenomenology is something that is not philosophy proper, and logic is, and it becomes a necessary condition to understand the project of logic. But in all of these things, again, the relationship between absolute knowledge and absolute ethical life hasn't been answered necessarily, other than saying that whatever these are, whatever differences they have, those differences are put together as some unity in the logic. The whole idea of the absolute ethical life and absolute knowledge are not so different, or the practical and the theoretical are not quite distinct, you know, domains. That would be the task of logic.
Yes, just very quickly. I like what you just said. That I am, how to say, right now I read the same quote, page 45, but now I have a slightly different understanding based on what you just said. Will it be responsible to say that for Kant is using alternative ideas to kind of replace or challenge Kant's dichotomic thinking, right? And is it responsible to say Kant's dichotomy, the one and the other, they do not necessarily need each other to be complete, but that craving for the other two poles, not necessarily two, but say phenomenology needs or calls for the logic, and that logic presupposes or presumes phenomenology. This, and I don't know how absolute ethical life fit in here, but it seems to be in such a mutually constituting relationship, just like phenomenology and the logic which you described just now. Is that the key difference between how Hegel and Kant approach the concept of a separation or categorization, that we can put things into different boxes, but we shouldn't fix such categories and buffer them to make the exchange of flow across them impossible, as like a kind of.
Yes, I think there is something there, and I think I remember from our other conversations on this text, you mentioned something that is very relevant to what you just said. So Hegel does not have any problem with, emphasizing on the quote unquote practical side, right? Emphasizing on religion, emphasizing on art, emphasizing on politics, emphasizing on natural sciences, right? What he has problems with is that not understanding those abstractions as abstractions, right? So I think we can think about Hegel's system in this way. The logic ultimately discloses what every other science is abstracting from, right? Like, make sense of this whole idea of taking abstractions as abstractions.
Right.
When we're talking about the theoretical, that's an abstraction. That doesn't mean that there's no valid discussion in the theoretical domain. That just means that the concept of theoretical is not a sui generis autonomous region that now we need to wonder how we should bridge this to the practical domain. Right. Theoretical domain is just an abstraction from a prior unity, like a prior connection, an original relationship that exists, and that relationship is what logic discloses, right? Logic discloses that basic relationship, because what logic discloses, from my understanding, is the basic identity within difference, is Hegelian term, of thought and being, right? It happens at that basic level, right? So that's the ultimate point of logic. So that's why I think the idea will be that in logic we will have the comprehensive picture, and in that comprehensive picture, now we could have a book that is about, politics, but we are not thinking about politics that politics is just this autonomous region, this island that, whatever happens in natural sciences is just like happening in a completely different world, and these two worlds are, absolutely distinct, and now we have to wonder, like, this world of norms, how it could be bridged to the world of the causes. No. We will understand that as an abstraction, as a useful one, maybe as a necessary one, but as an abstraction, nevertheless.
I see. Now I have a better understanding. Yes, I see.
Yeah, I think that's the idea. One other thing that is important, because Rose's interest is more on the absolute ethical life, like, and another place that these two versions of the absolute come together is the way that Rose understands the relation between art, religion, and philosophy. Because art, religion, and philosophy are discussed extensively in the phenomenology as well, which ends at the absolute knowledge. And the way that they are discussed are more in terms of like how Hegel conceives, or not Hegel externally, but the internal experience of consciousness through the phenomenology, proves art and religion as a failed attempts to absolute knowledge. They are attempts to resolve the basic dichotomic, the tension, but they fail. Now, in Rose's account, both art and religion are thought as, parts of absolute ethical life. Or the way she puts it, for instance, is that absolute ethical life is represented or intuited by art. So a little bit of clarification of like what is going on here could also get us a better understanding of what we are talking about when we are talking about the absolute. Now, the way that Rose talks about this, the way that she presents art and religion, somehow kind of puts together absolute knowledge and absolute ethical life alongside one another, but it still is not clear to me exactly how these two are related. So if we go back to the point about the basic dichotomic
Right.
structure between subject and object, between self and the world,
Right.
between universe in particular, Rose presents Hegel's argument, especially in earlier texts, as showing that art and religion attempt to solve that problem and they fail, right? And the way they fail is that they want to present absolute ethical life, but only in imagination. So I'm quoting from Rose, and with that, we could probably get a better understanding of what she has in mind. She says in 74 that art and religion is absolute in the sense that it presents absolute ethical life, but it is also imagination, Vorstellung, or intuition, a form of misrecognition, because configuration or image or intuition predominate.
Right.
So what I think Rose is saying here is that art and religion want to make sense of the absolute ethical life, but they are not able to do that. This idea of making sense of absolute ethical life, right? They want to present absolute ethical life. I wonder how this is related to knowledge. Is art, for instance,
right,
then an attempt to know something that we call absolute ethical life, which is this absolute ethical life, let's say, is this meaningful relation between individual and the society, right? What actually is the relation between individual and the society, and the subject and object, right? Art wants to present that, but it fails. Religion wants to present that, but it fails. So art and religion are failed forms of absolute knowledge, because if absolute knowledge is the solution to the problem of dichotomic thinking, and the dichotomic thinking is about that dichotomy between subject and object, universal and particular, individual and social, then if art is a failure in the form of a knowledge of those things. That's one way to look at it. But when we think about religion, for instance, then it becomes a little bit tricky, because religion is not just about one, we can think about art as, trying to find this resolution as some sort of individual romantic, presentation of the self in the world, right? You can think about it in that kind of an image. But in religion, it's more like a social activity. Are we thinking about religion as a viewpoint of the world, or we're thinking about religion as a group of religious people living? What is this relationship between art, religion, and absolute ethical life that is a failure? What are they trying to do that they fail at? That's one of the things that I am not sure about in this story. That what exactly art and religion are trying, or as what they are trying, right? As forms of knowledge, as forms of social practice. What is their failure? What kind of failure they have?
Yes, I have to confess that I haven't read Hegel's own writing on art and religion myself, but based on Rose and based on our conversation, here's some thought, okay? And you, Hegel expert, can tell me whether that corresponds to his writing at all. I think art and religion are failed attempts in the sense that they started, but they are attempts towards absolute ethical life nonetheless. And in that sense, that they started to pay close attention to social ethical life and try to figure out, make sense of all the problems, but their solution somehow separates them from that initial connection or engagement with that ethical life. Art started to develop its own, as you mentioned, knowledge. Once you no longer just look at a tree to paint a tree, but you look at a master's painting of a tree to paint a tree, then you are already distant from the reality. Same thing with religion. it's come perhaps in certain cases, such historical examples that Hegel gave, perhaps as a kind of a social critique. It was very much embedded in the social relationship of that specific moment. But then it started to gain its own life. It depicted the heavens, so as like the Zolan thing, as the better social blueprint to reform the contemporary society. But if the social relation moves on, but you still stick with that depiction of a heaven, then the project is no longer embedded in social reality. And unlike philosophy, perhaps the third or more hopeful attempt with absolutism, they do not seem to have developed a robust way to examine the widening distance between presentation and the representation. And so art and religion moved in more a paradigm shift way when this is like too distant here. Okay, Reformation comes. We just update that or radically transform, redraw the picture of heaven to guide our contemporary time. But the very problem still is with us because our social life will still move on, and the successful part of this revolution, Reformation, whatever, they become the dominant view, and they dominate the knowledge or so-called discourse of what religious life should be, and try to impose that abstracted, buffered knowledge onto social relationship. Then again, it goes back to that dominant nation relationship. It was fine for a while as long as you're in a very powerful position versus the resisting parties. But when the resisting party become powerful enough, yet another revolution, yet another reformation. So there's no end to this. How to say it? Perhaps the connection or the recognition happens only at a very rare moment. But for the longest period of time, majority of so-called history, it's really trying to use the knowledge or the self-understanding of art or religion to regulate, say, the practice of art and religion. So again, dichotomy thinking crept in and dominate this project. So if it's dominated by dichotomy thinking, this project cannot really reach the absolute. That's my understanding based on what we talked about.
So that's interesting. And I think this, we are going to get to this, but I think this is a good time in response to what you said to like express my like maybe basic structural issue here, right? So from what I understand, the overcoming the dichotomy thinking, right? The overcoming of this dichotomy thinking of subjectivity and objectivity, that itself could present itself as not as an either or, but maybe there is an and here, right?
Right.
Some intellectual achievement or some socio-political achievement.
Right.
So in the case of religion and art, religion is easier for me to understand. Religion is incapable of overcoming the dichotomy thinking, the tensed up, isolated relationship between subject and object, because it postpones the answer, the unity, to some other time, to some otherworldly, as Rose calls it. The religion is a form of recognition too. Instead of presenting absolute like as a real recognition is misrepresented as occurring in a world distinct from the world of real and social and political relations. So if we think about absolute ethical life, if we think about overcoming that dichotomy nature as it presents itself in the socio-political relations, religion is a failure because religion just posits that unity to some other realm, right? That's how religion fails, how that Christianity fails.
Right.
Now, art fails in a different way because our art also, with that kind of a maybe more individualistic, or not necessarily individualistic, but like a personal experience of overcoming the difference, right, like a romantic unity that one has with the world. Again, the answer doesn't show itself in the socio-political relations. the answer doesn't show itself in the socio-political relations, not by accident or contingency. It cannot be that. It does not recognize the problem as a problem that exists in the real socio-political relations. You see, that is the basic problem with art and religion, that they don't understand the problem as a problem that shows itself in that relation, in that actual political relations. But I think they cannot do that, according to Hegel, because they are incapable of formulating the problem even. Art and religion are incapable of achieving something intellectually, which is required, which makes it clear why this is a real social and political issue.
I see.
And not just, a matter of love or faith or some other type of mystical relationship with the world. Right? Which I think he thinks philosophy does that. But before we get to philosophy, tell me what you think.
Yes, two things. First is more a question. You can probably pick up that after finishing my second part. Is what's the relationship between art and religion? Are they, say, equivalent in the sense, here are three paths: philosophy, art, religion, or they're more just the examples given by Hegel to substantiate the failed attempts in general? Because both art and religion, the boundary is very, very blurry in I don't know, in my understanding, and also in social recognition. If you commission a cathedral, is that in the realm of art or is it in the realm of religion? And something deeper connects the two, is that both are dealing with creating and maintaining a symbolic system that intersect with ethical life, but it also has its kind of own logic, quite somewhat independent of the social life. And if you want to do art or do religion, sometimes you must take into consideration of that not largely self-referential symbolic system, which does not necessarily acknowledge that the agents in doing that are still in their ethical life. So you can be somehow brought into a otherworldly world, basically, as you mentioned, the sort of religion. But also, yes, that's my question. I hope you got it. And the second is, Hegel seems to, in addressing all these, Hegel always brings history in, but it seems like his history in his project plays a very different role for a historian or for a philosopher of a history. It's history somehow has a very unique position here. Would you like to elaborate that as well? Yes.
So in terms of the relation between art and religion, and whether, for instance, if you're thinking about art and religion as failed attempts, first of all, art is just there are other mystical experience that is not really Christian and was happening in Jewish traditions in Europe. Is that part of this story? Is that another thing that is omitted from this story? Are there let's just give Hegel what he wants in terms of thinking of this as the phenomenology of a European experience. Right. Let's just give him that for the sake of the argument. I'm sure there are all sorts of activities happening in that society, right. Magic. What is magic doing in this scenario? Although he has some ideas about magic, interestingly enough, but a mystical tradition in Judaism, I think, would be a good example that is not part of religion as Hegel describes it, because he is very much stuck with the Christian representation. But it seems to me mysticism of I don't know much about mysticism in Judaism, but mysticism in Islam differently is about bridging something, not just bridging in this Kantian sense, but acknowledgement of the lack of any distinction, the lack of this identity is part of it. Are those part of this story? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. What I think is that Hegel doesn't think that he needs to do an exhaustive historical account, that unless he finds all the examples of these attempts, he hasn't found it. He hasn't found the solution. I think all he needs is more like a higher category of the types of attempts, right? Which could be challenged. Then the question will be, could we formulate a different category of activity that is neither art nor religion and not philosophy either, which is also fits this description of overcoming dichotomic thinking in the way that we have described, and it's its own thing? I think that would be the challenge, or that's the question. If the answer to that question is positive, then Hegel's account is not complete, right, especially if that other practice is part of the historical tradition in the West, in Europe, right? So in the similar fashion, I think it is be related. I mean, I agree with you in the sense that both, like what we talked about so far, in the sense that art and religion both kind of have like a self-ejection from the sociopolitical relations, and that's how they come together. About their distinction, like where does art end, where does Stoicism, religion begin? I'm not entirely sure about that either. But I don't think Hegel needs that distinction in this analysis. At least he doesn't think that he needs it. I think the way that he distinguishes between the two, insofar as this point about, the absolute is concerned, insofar as that question is concerned, which I think is the only thing that Hegel is concerned about here, right, is that religion has, one, a more clear societal structure to it in terms of Christianity. Two, it is an attempt of creating a story about the world, the self and the world, and the relation that they have, that it takes to be objective, which doesn't need to be the case in art, I think. Like, it has more, I think, for Hegel, religion as a practice and religion as a narrative, a story about the relation between self and the world, right, and the imagery of that, both attempts to be objective and in a way social, in a way that we are the children of God, right, as this kind of a unity, as we are part of this story as a we, and that we is very comprehensive. And in art, it is more particularized, it's more experiential, it's more, just related to my story. Like, my artistic experience brings me that unity. My artistic experience bridges this gap, So that's what I got here about the two. One question that I have for you here, and then we can move on to the last two slides and the last two parts of this discussion, is that whatever this is, like, if Hegel thinks that the problem of dichotomic thinking, the problem of subject and object, represents itself at the societal structure, and the failure of art and religion is in the way that they intellectualize this story, they do not understand it as a sociopolitical, as existing in the sociopolitical relations, and not providing the answer in that realm. If we just take that for granted for a second, then religion as a category seems to be there to overcome a basic dichotomy, right, between the self and the world, for instance, the self and the cosmos, the finite and the infinite. Right, that seems to be what Hegel takes to be religion in this context. I wonder, based on your knowledge of world religion, is this true? Could be universalized as the aim of religion, or to what extent could be universalized as the religion? We see it because of an attempt in religion, because from my just personal experience with a little bit of mysticism in the Iranian version of Islam, definitely there is some sort of a parallel there. That is definitely existing. But is this about religion in general or no?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Based on my very limited knowledge of Hegel's understanding for religion, I think what he has in mind in religion has definitely cross-cultural counterparts. But in those civilizations, cultures, the thing he identifies as a religion for the West is not necessarily categorized as a religion per se. It could be, I think in China, the case will perhaps be history with a capital H or literature with a capital L, or in some other tradition, it could be poetry with a capital P. It's the civilization identity making mechanism that would keep the sense of nationhood even when the, say, empire or kingdom was no longer there. It envisions a world view, or it has a world view, envisions a social order, and that social order has been incorporated into how an individual is brought up in the manners, in the etiquette, in temperament, connection with the landscape, all those sort of things. So as you mentioned, religion contra art has the stronger emphasis on, say, the social or ethical life, and also envisions something like we defines us, other boundary, that sort of thing, which if we take this very loose and inclusive definition of religion, I would say yes, this religion, this attempt towards the absolute is certainly not unique to the West. But if we just take, say, Western definition of, let's say, Reformation definition of religion and try to find counterparts in other cultures, I think it's much harder for us to find that. So that's my, did I miss any important part you tried to ask?
Yes, so the part that I wonder, it seems like that what you are saying is that the religion in general has that attempt of creating a we, like there is a we that is created at the end of this. That's the unity that exists. But if, and you said as it represents itself in the like the social like how
right.
A human nature story could be part of it. Like we are this type of a being, so we have to do this. We have to have these like behavior in these contexts. But that part, I'm not sure if I see the same idea. Like the thing that I see in religion, in Reformation, as Hegel describes it, as it pertains to the phenomenological project and the concept of absolute, is very much directed about like the self and cosmos, and understanding that relationship and that distinction as a problem that needs a resolution.
I see.
Now I'm thinking about, for instance, like the Buddhists. Like, of course, the Buddhists do not have they have a very strange answer to the question of the relationship. But the question, it seems like they are very concerned about the question. Yes. Right? That's what I meant in terms of like whether this is universal. Is this part of it universal?
I see. Okay. I'm personally a subscriber of the axial age debate. I think it's a meaningful debate. So the answer to your question in that specific school of thought is, yes, it's not unique to the West, but it's not universal either. It's a specific stage of a cultural development, which, since you are here, we include Iran, which happened in 5 specific civilizations: the ancient Israelites, ancient Greek, ancient Iranian, ancient Chinese, and ancient Indian. It's at the same time a discovery of so-called self, and on the same time elaborate theoretical debates on the relationship between this recently discovered self and the cosmos, and also the boundary of moral concern. There's a universal dimension towards that moral concern. You do not exclude a person from your moral community just because of that person's language, race, or whatever. There, you recognize, because you have discovered the concept of individual self, you recognize something unites you and that person. So universal particular dichotomy is there, and different civilizations, the 5 came up with a different system, primarily through so-called world religions, to both regulate this self-cosmos relationship and try to spread this knowledge to other neighboring places. So I think that's quite valid in terms of empirical evidence, but I'm not sure whether these examples are the only examples out there. And perhaps sometimes we are misguided by some presumption of, say, cultural evolution, such, say, self-discovery of self or question over the self-cosmos relationship. We presume is never there in, say, specific Australian Aboriginal tribes. We are limited by presumption, but I think for these cases, they're absolutely there.
I see.
But I don't think it is universal either, because for these cases, they evolved only in certain period of time. Iron technology or urbanization predated such discovery of self or questioning over this self-world relationship by centuries, if not millennia. So it's not necessary for a materially well-off and sophisticated society with division of labor to question over this, but those may not be the necessary condition of such thinking.
I see. That's very informative. And as you mentioned history, I would just do this very briefly and we can move to the next one. What Hegel is doing, just to make it clear, does not need this to be universal, right? Hegel does not need to if it's shown that the Aboriginals of Australia, their conception of religion does not have anything to do with the relationship with itself and the world, or it's not an attempt to resolve this tension, Hegel would not blink, because at the core of the phenomenological process, Hegel thinks this ends up being about the story of European spirit. It's about that history of a region in the world, which is itself a very interesting question and challenge for Hegel to determine what are the boundaries, who is involved in this story, who is part of this story. But one thing is clear, that historical experience find its way to the conceptual analysis that happens in the phenomenology. That historical struggle, that historical set of failures or experiences finds itself in the process of the conceptual education of consciousness in the phenomenology. Now, we can ask all sorts of interesting questions here. If we take this book and this project that ends with the concept of the absolute to a place that clearly is not part of this story, right? What is this book there, right? Is it like it's going to be invalid for them? It's going to be, it isn't going to make sense. It's going to be externally, it makes sense in abstraction, but does not make sense in a social way. What kind of an argument Hegel is providing? That's the basic problem. Because, let's talk about Kant for a second. Kant doesn't think that Aboriginals or Indians or Maya, there is no difference. This is something that is more, this is very logical. It's a law of non-contradiction. That's all there is. So it doesn't need to be anything. It doesn't need, it's not dependent on the ethical life. But Hegel seems to think that something depends on the ethical life. But do philosophical arguments depend on ethical life in their validity? Is the validity of a philosophical argument itself dependent on something from the ethical life? Or that validity is something that transcends the ethical life, right? So that itself is an interesting question. And I think that Hegel would be leaning towards saying that logic, the science of logic, is true independent, not independent. The truth of logic is dependent. It was possible because of socio-historical achievement, but the truth of it is not dependent on that socio-historical structural. But we will get to all of these things very shortly, because
Yes.
all of these questions are piling up and we have a good way to put them together. Before saying that, the final absolute ethical life that Hegel talks about, according to Rose, is philosophy.
Right.
And the way that this is presented is that philosophy finally is the one that could make sense of that dichotomic thinking, and by making sense of it, overcome it. And this is done through understanding the relationship between subject and an object speculatively.
Right.
The relationship is not a normal judgment, but it is speculative.
Right.
And, Rose tells us that to read a proposition speculatively means that the identity which is affirmed between subject and predicate is seen equally to affirm a lack of identity between subject and predicate, right? And this whole idea of identical but not identical is something that philosophy could express, right? And this is not some sort of a statement that could be just understood as an isolated a statement that could be just, it cannot be prejudged in the language that Rose uses. It must be, and I'm quoting here, this different kind of identity must be understood as a result to be achieved. Right. The subject of the proposition is no longer fixed and abstract with external contingent accidents, but initially an empty name, uncertain and problematic, gradually acquiring meaning as a result of a series of contradictory experiences, which is something that happens in the phenomenology, right? And this takes us back to the whole thing about dialectics, how this is connected. Dialectics is connected to the overcoming of dichotomic thinking through dialectics, which is not a presupposed method. At the end, it becomes clear as dialectics. We can overcome the dichotomic thinking because all of those lack of identities, we basically develop a language as much as we develop a statement. We develop an understanding of the relationship between different elements of a linguistic unit at the end. And with philosophy and with that activity, we reach the point. We reach the point that we have solved, and this is going to be very problematic, and this will become the final point of our discussion. We have somehow solved the basic unit of dichotomic thinking with philosophy. And here, the final quote that I have, not the final quote, I have one more, but the one on philosophy that I have from Rose, it's this. It is the time, after the time of art and religion, for the owl of Roman Minerva, the esoteric concept of philosophy, to spread its wings and to turn back, or rather forwards, into Greek Athena, the goddess of the unity of the police and philosophy, absolute ethical life, the exoteric unity of theory and practice, of concept and intuition. 82. So, what have we achieved? Let's say we go through the phenomenological process, we comprehend this unity the way Rose describes it. Right. What has really happened in that process, right? And I think it's the time to elaborate on this, because we have talked about this in this conversation over and over again, but now it's time to just see it clearly, what options we're having when we're talking about the absolute. Is the absolute an intellectual achievement or a socio-historical achievement, or something that is either or both or a combination, right?
I talk like a Buddhist.
Yeah. So one option is to think about the absolute as an intellectual achievement that was made possible because of a socio-historical achievement, right? So if we think about absolute in this sense, what absolute is is this intellectual achievement that philosophy could achieve, and Hegel has achieved it. And this achievement was not an intellectual achievement in vacuum. So if you ask Hegel whether the Aboriginals of Australia could have achieved it, he would say no. There are some necessary historical, institutional points that are needed for this to be comprehended. But we have achieved something intellectual, right? That intellectual achievement is an understanding of what absolute ethical life is, what is overcoming of the basic dichotomy actually means, right? Now, if that's the scenario,
right,
we can think of ourselves as like joining Hegel's club. When we understand absolute, we just join this club. Now, Hegel's phenomenology is all about the skepticism, right? All about this thoroughgoing skepticism. Now, I have a skepticism about this that I don't think it's addressed directly by Hegel here, at least, which is more like a Nietzschean skepticism. Like, what is the value of this intellectual achievement? Is it like an intellectual achievement that is just, satisfies a group of people who happen to be interested to solve this problem? Or this is something that is far more basic, that its value is more than just some, I have this random interest in solving this problem, right? But if it's just an intellectual achievement, it seems to be a little bit limited in terms of its value. Although I have to mention something that is present in Hegel, that Hegel thinks that philosophy is the highest expression of human freedom, right? And we don't need to go into the depths of that, but that's what he thinks. And he thinks that freedom is not just a random value, right? Freedom is something that is very, 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 very basic about what it means to be a human being.
Right.
And freedom is not about liberty, it's not about lack of obstacles. It's none of that, right? Freedom as autonomy, freedom as self-determination, that kind of freedom. So I think if we say that Hegel thinks that this is the story, that the absolute is an intellectual achievement that was made possible because of a socio-historical achievement, and we ask Hegel what is the value of that, he says that the value of that is that this is a satisfaction of something. This intellectual achievement does not need to, we shouldn't think of this as intellectual in this weird way.
Right.
It's intellectual, just like some...
Not nerdy or anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a nerdy achievement. It is an intellectual achievement that has a satisfying element to it.
Right.
And because of that, it's worth. In this sense, we can have a little bit of a different, like in the same kind of a category of understanding the absolute. We can think of the absolute as an intellectual recognition of a socio-historical achievement. And I want to make this difference clear, right? We could say that the intellectual achievement, there is an intellectual achievement.
Right.
Some socio-historical things must have been in place for this to be achieved. But this achievement itself is not about those socio-historical achievements. You see, it just happens to be the case that we need that structure. Now we're talking about this. Just as an example, right? String theory as an intellectual achievement of the science of physics is only possible because of some socio-historical achievements, right? If you don't have certain institutions, certain, means of communication, corrections, labs, all of that, then there is no string theory. But it's not like the development of the institution of, string theory is not about the development of the political institutions of the United States. It's not about them. That intellectual achievement is something that rests upon them, but it's not about them.
Right.
Now, this variation that I'm introducing is not that. The variation is an intellectual recognition of a socio-historical achievement. So the absolute as the philosophical achievement is about the recognition of something that is being achieved, of a something actually existing. It is the explicit version of that implicit socio-historical achievement.
Right.
And in that sense, we can think about it as some sort of a collective self-knowledge. Now we know what we have achieved.
Right.
Now we know ourselves as what we actually are.
It's kind of a diploma at the end of your graduate coursework. You have already done the coursework, and now here's a recognition. Yeah. That sort of thing.
But I think it's more than a stamp, more than a ceremony, though, because I think there is. Think about it this way.
Okay.
Think about it this way. That you have done your coursework, but for some reason you don't know it. You don't know that you have done your coursework.
I see.
Right? You have taken this course. You have written that, book. You have talked to this other guy, and suddenly you put these things together.
I see.
And you're like, oh, I've already achieved what I thought I wasn't achieving. I thought of this as fragments, but now I see the unity.
I see. Yeah, it's very different. Now I see.
So the picture of the diploma is more like a stamp, and I don't think any of these viewpoints is.
That's the Kantian project. That's prejudged. You already know what to do before starting doing this project. Like,
yes, you have already.
I'm talking about the administrative side. But
yes,
I see. This is a speculative thing. You really didn't know what it means to have a diploma.
Yes, exactly. You didn't know what it means to have a diploma, and you wouldn't have known it if you didn't do all of those things.
Yes, I see.
Right? You can probably externally explain to someone, like, you need all of these things to have a diploma. But it's not going to suffice. That kind of a recognition does not exist. So that's one way to think about this. And both of these intellectual achievement or recognition that I try to make clear here in this interpretation it's already over. We have it. It's just there. That doesn't mean that, again, we could just go to the last page of like phenomenology and just read it, and that's the answer. But it needs to be achieved by anyone who reads it. But Hegel has already achieved it. But there is another way to still think about this as an intellectual achievement, but think about it as that is something to come, right? That there is a possible intellectual achievement that is possible because of a socio-historical achievement, but we haven't achieved it yet. Now what the absolute knowledge then means is that, okay, this is just a step. Now the door has been opened,
right,
for that possible intellectual achievement. And this takes us back to what I was trying to say about the relationship between phenomenology and logic, right? Now, the absolute knowledge that is at the end of the standpoint of the absolute that is at the end of the phenomenology, both had this element of, knowledge of something that is about that absolute ethical life, but that itself just generates a whole set of new questions. Right. Like the intellectual achievement hasn't been done, right? Because this is also related to what Hegel, one of the things that Hegel is notorious for, the whole thing about the end of philosophy.
I see.
Right? Whether there is some, you can think about this within the Hegel's territory in terms of the ending of this. Is the phenomenology the end? And most probably that's not the case. But is the logic the end? Has philosophy as a project ended by resolving this basic dichotomic issue, right? Or philosophy continues? There are still philosophical questions to be asked. So this is both about Hegel's project and something more bigger than that. And we could also think about this as a possible intellectual recognition of a socio-historical achievement, and the difference between achievement and recognition is going to be the exact same thing, but the recognition is still to come, or to come in the sense that it's to come in Hegelian system, or to come in the sense that it hasn't been achieved. I think most certainly Hegel thinks that at least the basic structures of this has been achieved. But that's a different. He thinks something has been achieved.
Okay.
Something important has been achieved, right? But the last two options that I have here, as the way that we could understand the absolute, are more sophisticated,
right,
and more interesting in terms of how things are put together, right? In these two, we think of the absolute not as an intellectual achievement or recognition, but as a possible socio-historical achievement. Okay. A possible socio-historical achievement that is possible through an intellectual achievement, which discloses the absence of that possible socio-historical achievement. What does that mean?
Yes.
That means that at the end of this inquiry, we have an intellectual achievement. That intellectual achievement is the philosophical expression of a non-dichotomic relationship between subject and object, right? And that intellectual achievement, very well may be the case, was contingent upon all sorts of socio-historical achievements, right? Something before that made this possible. But as soon as we achieve that intellectual achievement, we realize that we are not living in that type of a society at all, right? So now we have some sort of a blueprint, right? That blueprint was contingent about all sorts of socio-historical achievements of the past, but that blueprint is yet to be achieved, not intellectually, but sociopolitically.
I see.
Right? And I think that's how Marx works, right? I think that's how, and not regarding the concept of absolute, but something very, very similar. That Marx thinks that, he has figured out that unity to come between individual and society, for instance, between subjective and objective, but the socio-political structures that are existing is not doing that, right? It's not creating that. It's not existent, right? But we might strive for it. We have the blueprint.
I see.
But of course, if we have the blueprint, we're back to the Zolan.
Right. Yes, right? Exactly.
Now,
I was going to say.
Now, this expression of this intellectual achievement as a Zolan is something that makes the whole thing. If the whole point was to overcome the dichotomy, then what is this one? What is this Zolan? And Rose definitely thinks that Marx falls into the whole point about Zolan, and he does not really understand the stuff that he criticizes and he wants to overcome, right? Religion. Rose thinks he stays at a very, very abstract level and general claim level of what religion is.
Right.
She thinks that he does not have any concept of culture, like what culture is, what this formation, reformation really refer to. And one side note that I find it interesting is that Rose thinks that Marx does not understand capitalism as a culture, which I think is a fascinating point to be made. So, okay, and that seems to be something that Rose or Hegel cannot understand. But, there is another version of this that might be something closer to at least Rose's understanding of what is going on here. That the absolute could be a possible socio-historical achievement that is possible through the intellectual recognition of our collective denial of an existing socio-historical achievement. What is that? What is the difference between this and the last one? It is not that we need to restructure our socio-political institutions as if we are entering a completely new world, right? it is more about forgetting. We have forgotten something that we have achieved, or we have failed to create the necessary socio-political educational structures in which we are reminded what we have achieved.
Okay.
Right? And that reminder, that intellectual recognition of this existing but hidden socio-historical achievement could be transformative, but not the Marxist way. Because what Marx wants to say is that we have not achieved that unity, right? So if we go back to the point about the absolute, if the absolute is expressed in philosophy as the speculative proposition in which the dichotomy between subject and object is overcome, right? When Marx would look with a Marxist lens looking at that, Marx would say we have never achieved that in ethical life. That hasn't happened. Hegel would say we have already achieved it. Right? But if this project for Rose makes sense, then something is missing in this history, right? That makes Hegel Contra Sociology a meaningful project in the first place. And I think that what is missing is not that we need to, as a Zolan, go and say that, oh, this is how societies should be in a very basic sense. No, all we need is this collective recognition of this existing socio-historical achievement and making that find its way to our institutions. And that institutions include universities and the study of society.
I see. That's a very interesting way to read the whole project.
That's how I understand how this whole thing comes together. And the last quote is from Rose. She makes this problem clear that there is this very thin line of thinking of Hegel as transformative in terms of in a socio-political way, and not turning him into a Zolan, not turning him to a Marx. Right? So Rose writes that since the day of philosophy, of freedom, has not yet come, the system fell victim to three fates which Hegel himself identified. The first fate is a continuing victory of reflection over reason, right? So we haven't recognized that. We are still doing that. The sociology is still Kantian, right? The educational system is still Kantian. The second fate is that the Hegelian alternative would itself become something actual made dominant. Right? And the third fate is that it would become a concept which commands. So both of them mean that, again, I'm back to the quotation, if Hegel's thought is treated as a Zolan, a concept, this concept may be turned against illegality, thus presupposing the existing law and assimilated to its purpose. So in this way, it might collapse into the same thing that it wants to tackle. But she says something else that I think might encompass what she is looking for here. She says, or this Zolan, this concept, may be invoked in opposition to the real lawlessness of the prevailing social order. In the former case, this fate heralds the end of philosophy. In the latter case, it heralds the dawn of a new vocation, which may in its turn be reformed and perverted. All three of these fates are determined by the continuing domination of the relations of the bourgeois, private property, and law. Yeah, I'm not sure about what this, there are some points of this later part that I see an opening, but there are other parts that it just goes back to this pessimistic vision that any way of thinking about the quote unquote reforming power of this is just going back to the problems of the Zolan.
Okay.
Right? But what is the dawn of a new vocation? Right? What is this new vocation? And if Rose thinks that thinking about Hegel's absolute will turn us to this, Zolan will be back, that this seems to be doomed too. So
Right.
what is Hegel contra sociology? That's all I got. That's all I got.
Thank you very much. I finally started to see the whole book as a coherent project. It's definitely not easy for people who haven't read Hegel. Thank you very much for this.
Sure.
I think I have a much better understanding. So what's next? Tell our listeners.
So I think we are doing a couple of things that is very much related to what we did here and what the whole thing that we started, enlightenment, counter-enlightenment.
Right.
So one thing is to get a better understanding of what Hegel is doing, and Hegel thinks of any sort of solution, right? And the relationship that he envisions between philosophy and ethical life, and therefore the relation between absolute knowledge and absolute ethical life. And we are going to talk about phenomenology at some stages, but we think that we should focus on Hegel's logic to get two main things that are very related to Rose's project, get a better understanding of those possible resolutions that Hegel has for those things. First of all, is the problem of method, that how is he gonna move in the logic?
Methodless method,
what is this methodless method that Hegel has in the logic, like how this works in action, and also if the whole point that Rose is emphasizing on, the dichotomic thinking, if the most basic form of this dichotomy is treated in the logic between thought and being, then what happens there? What does even, because we can ask the same question, what does even mean to say that we have resolved the dichotomy between thought and being? Is that itself a thought? Is that itself must present itself in the socio-political relations existing in a society? What is the resolution even? What kind of an achievement is it? Which is the question that we are ending this book with, right? And also there is another element that we're gonna focus on in the next a couple of episodes, and that's the concept of law, because Rose thinks about Hegel's phenomenology. I don't have the exact quote, but she mentions it very clearly, that she thinks of Hegel's project as, in phenomenology, as identifying bad conceptions of law as understood by Kant and Fichte. Like there are all sorts of ways to misunderstand what law is, and then collapsing law as morality, for instance, law as a moral commandment, for instance. And therefore, according to this interpretation, at the end of the phenomenology, you must have the right understanding of the law, which means the right understanding of the ethical life. What is this law? What is law? And we might venture out and go to, thinkers that are not Hegelian in any direct way, at least, and see how is law perceived even from a legal perspective? Like, what do we mean by law? And then have a more, comprehensive view of how Hegel's position fare against those positions, get related to those positions, and basically what is the connection between those accounts. So we're not done.
Yes. Story.
Stay with us.
Yes.
We're not done.
Keep it tuned, dear listeners. Hegel's logic and the heart's the magnum opus, the concept of law, is coming up. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.